A lot of people go to these crystal cities, they call them. So they'll go into a city that is a glowing city. It's like crystal that has light under it and it's glowing, but it's definitely a city. And these cities often contain what they call halls of knowledge, that people will go into these halls of knowledge and they'll describe it looks like a library or it looks like something like a library, but it's different. But they're able to absorb information and apparently a lot of it.
I'm here today with a special guest, Paul Perry, who is an author and researcher of near death experiences. He actually works tandemly with Dr. Moody and Dr. Moody's research and Dr. Moody's books as well. He's a documentary filmmaker who's been featured on the History Channel. You can find his videos on Amazon, Hulu, all the big ones. Thank you so much for joining me today, Paul. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a great honor to me. I want to know, first of all, how you got interested in the topic of near-death experiences.
It was, like I say, we've been working together for 37 years, so that would be about 1998, 97. I was executive editor of a magazine called American Health Magazine. It was the most successful magazine in the 1980s. And I got a call from my book agent, and he took me out to lunch and he said, "Well, would you like to write a book? He said, I have a client who's having trouble pulling the triggers," he put it, on a book. Uh, would you like to work with him? I said, "Sure, I'll work with him. Who is it?" And Nat said, "Well, it's Raymond Moody." And he was like full of drama about it. And I said, "I don't know who Raymond Moody is." And he says, "Okay." He named and defined the near-death experience. I said, "I really don't know that much about near-death experiences." And he's a hard little guy, uh, Nat. So he said to me, for the editor of a big health magazine, you're not very smart. You need to study up on near-death experiences." And so I said, "Okay." So I flew down to Georgia, which is where Raymond lived at the time. And I found someone that I didn't expect at all. Uh, I expected, a guy in a suit, a doctor, a psychiatrist, kind of hard bitten, has no time for anything, always has his phone in his hand. And instead, I found Raymond Moody, which is entirely different person, very kind, has a wonderful voice. Should have been on Andy and Mayberry, actually. He has that type of voice. And we started to work on a book called The Light Beyond, which was our first book. And like I say, I knew nothing about near-death experiences. So, being the great teacher he is, he started teaching me about near-death experiences, the different stages, what happens when a person dies, giving me case studies to read, and it all came together for me in my head. And so we wrote this book. We completed it in just a few months. I spent a lot of time down there. And what I noticed was that there were some gaps in the book. In other words, the gap was that there's no research on children and near-death experiences. That was a big gap that I found. And so I said, Raymond, we really should do something about children and NDEs. Well, I have hardly anything. No one has anything on it. There's one guy in Seattle who's working on it, Melvin Morse. If you want to do a book with him, I'll arrange it. And he did. So I went to Seattle and I wrote a book with Melvin called Closer to the Light. Meanwhile, The Light Beyond came out. It was on Oprah. So that was a big hit. And I wrote this book with Melvin. I thought it would be the easiest book to sell because it was on children and near-death experiences. Who wasn't interested? And it turned out the publishers weren't interested. We sent the book out, the proposal out to 19 publishers. It was rejected by 17 of them right away with rejection letters like people don't care that much about their children. Uh, Children can't have meaningful experiences. or this sounds like a magazine article to me, not a book, or it just, I found a typo on page 2, so I don't want to do any business with you. There was one of those. And we had ultimately one publisher who wanted it, and that was HarperCollins. Random House. It was Random House. And it was Diane Reverend. And so I'm on the phone with her, looking through the rejection slips. And she says, this book is going to be huge. If you do it right, it'll be gigantic. And it was. The book came out. It immediately Oprah grabbed it. We were on like twice over the next 6 months or so, and the book was huge. And at that point, I realized that my best connection in this field was Raymond. Because he was always steering me in the right direction. If he didn't know about something, he would want me to check it out, and I would end up writing a book about it. And that's how we came together. And then over the course of the years, uh, I've done a lot of editorial work, so I can give people a lot of guidance. And I started finding things that we should do as books. And so the way we work always is the way we worked in the beginning. We'd sit on his porch. He lived he lived in Carrollton for a while, Georgia, but then he moved to Choccolocco Creek in Alabama. And we would sit on the creek and rock. He has a big rocking chair fan. He would drink Coca-Cola all day long. And we'd listen to all the tapes I have of him have sounds of him rocking and of the creek. And we would talk about ways to turn this stuff into books. And we just came up with a lot of really great ideas. And that's been my career with Raymond.
You have a book recently released called Proof of Life After Life: 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife,
Right.
which is a groundbreaking book, really. Um, and it explores the question of, and I talked to Dr. Moody about this in my interview with him, about what happens when we die. So, can you add to that? What happens when we die? What do you think?
Okay. Well, let me kind of back into that. Uh, we had worked together, as you know, for years. And I had always thought that near-death experiences were very subjective. So, in other words, if I had a near-death experience, I'm the only one in this group that had experienced that, and I'm the only one that could really describe it. And there's no witnesses to my near-death experience, so that made it very subjective. And it bothered me that near-death experiences were so subjective, because I think the next step had to be something that would prove there was life after death. And so over the years, we always had these things in all of our books, just a couple of case studies of shared death experiences. And shared death experiences are when a person who is well, maybe they're at the deathbed of somebody, or they're having a precognitive experience, they witness someone else's death from the person's point of view, or they psychically connect with them. In the case of precognition, you might wake up in the middle of the night and see someone standing at the end of your bed, and a family member, let's say, and they tell you they're going to die, and then in the morning you find out they have died, and unexpectedly. That's precognitive experiences, and that's a shared death experience. That's objective, because someone else witnessed that at the same time as the person who died was talking to you. It's a psychic connection. And so what we had these all through all of our books over the years. And all of a sudden, on the same year, actually, Raymond and I both had shared death experiences of ourselves. Uh, I know Raymond probably described his. Uh, he had his with his mother, and he had his whole family gathered around her deathbed. She died kind of quickly in Nevada, and they all experienced different parts of her death experience. So I think there were 6 people there. 2 or 3 had the sensation of going up in a tunnel, which is part of a near-death experience. Some saw dead relatives along with her, and she was saying, talking to her husband at one point, who had been dead for some time. And they all saw that. They all saw the father in the room. They had the sense of going up a tunnel. Everything's kind of shape shifted in the room. And these are all, symptoms, if you will, of a shared death experience. So I had one as well. And mine was a little different from Raymond's, but it was interesting. My mother had Alzheimer's, kind of a rapid onset Alzheimer's. And on the day that she died, before she died, I got a phone call from a guy who was the head of neuropharmacology at University of Washington, Vernon Neppy. And Vernon and I had worked together on a book like 5 years earlier. We finished our work, and I had never talked to Vernon again, like for the next 5 years. But he calls me and he says, I was reading the paper this morning. It was on a Sunday. He said, I was reading the paper this morning and I heard a female voice say, call Paul Perry. And he said, I ignored it. And so he said, I got to the sports section and a voice came on again and said, call Paul Perry. So I'm calling you and I don't have any knowledge of why I'm calling you. And uh, and I said, well, that's pretty weird because he's in neuropharmacology. My mother had Alzheimer's, and that is his field. So I spent quite a bit of time talking to him. We were kind of puzzled that this had taken place, but we both went with it. And I was asking him what new treatments there were, what had he ever had successes in kind of reversing it for a period of time at least. And he told me everything he knew. And then toward the end of our conversation, I got the phone call. I got a phone call, it was clicking on the phone. And I said, Vernon, I've got to go. I have to answer this. And it was the care facility saying that my mother had died. Why she would ever connect through Vernon Neppy, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, I have no idea. But that was a shared death experience as well, because it was objective. I mean, I talked to Vernon, who apparently communicated with my mother and made the call, even though he had no idea why he was making the call. So that makes it objective. And we kept seeing these stories pop up in our work. But after we had our own, we got together and we were sitting out on the porch working on another book, a different book. And I said to Raymond, we've looked at all these years at shared death experiences. Nobody has done research on them. And that includes us. We just had these case studies, but no one really broke them apart or tried to go a step further. Why don't we just drop what we're doing and do that? And that's what we did. We just did a quick turnaround and did studies on shared death experiences.
And that's really beautiful. Shared death experiences are so validating because they come from people who didn't actually cross over. They're people that
Right.
didn't die. There wasn't a lack of oxygen in their brains.
Yeah.
So, what I find very fascinating about that is that they can offer another dimension of these experiences.
Mhm.
So, what do you think? Were you able to find out anything from your mother or from these shared death experiences that you were studying about what the afterlife looks like?
No, my mom had passed at that point. And but we do have conversations with people who have essentially passed over and then come back. And that's also the other side of the objective experience from the people who are the bystanders who who connect with the dying loved ones. And yeah, so we have heard all kinds of heavenly stories. I always kind of break them into a couple of categories. One is that in my mind, in many of these cases, heaven looks like Ireland. It's very green, it's moist, it's feels great to be there, and there's a great countryside. That's one definition I put with it, one description. The other description is a lot of people have go to these crystal cities, they call them. So they'll go into a city that is a glowing city. It's like crystal that has light under it and it's glowing, but it's definitely a city. And these cities often contain what they call halls of knowledge, that people will go into these halls of knowledge and they'll describe it looks like a library or it looks like something like a library, but it's different. But they're able to absorb information and apparently a lot of it. And some people, they retain it, other people don't, and they're very frustrated. They say, I went to this library of wisdom and I was filled with all this wisdom and I can't remember any of it. I can't remember very much, or it's generally, or I found out that love is the answer to everything. That's a common uh, response. But there are people who go to these halls of knowledge and they retain information. And those are very interesting. Lately, in the last few years, it used to be 30 some years ago that doctors wouldn't talk about this at all. They thought it was foolishness and they had no interest in talking about it. Nurses were different. But but now, over the past few years, we have a lot of doctors talking to us about it. And we have a couple of doctors who have I'll tell you a couple of them. Tony Socorro, who's an orthopedic surgeon north of Syracuse in New York. Uh, he was struck in the head by a light bolt of lightning, and he had a very profound near-death experience. And he somehow over there encountered information about music and about the piano. And he started to envision himself as playing in big concert halls. And when he came back, that's what he devoted his life, all of his spare time, to learning how to play the piano. And he had, he's a doctor, so he could afford, really great coaches and things. But he was obsessed by it. And to the point that he became really good and is really good at the piano. And to the point that he has played in European concert halls and even at Lincoln Center in New York. Uh,
Wow.
and he picked this all up on the other side. So there's several cases like this. Daniel Brinkley is one, but there's another one, a Dr. Rajiv Party. And he's Indian. He was the head of anesthesiology at Bakersfield Heart Hospital. And so he was very skilled and very, very materialistic. So he got an infection, an abdominal infection, and he had to be rushed. This was on Christmas Eve. He had to be rushed from Bakersfield to UCLA in Los Angeles. And in the middle of surgery, he had such a bad infection. I'll get icky here, that they had to open him up and swab pus out of his body. I mean, he was really that bad off. And he's had a very, very profound near-death experience. He he died. He had a cardiac arrest, and his uh, all these things appeared to him. First, let me see, how did it go first? He saw his father, and his father and he had never done well together because his father was very demanding of him. So demanding that he actually used to beat Raj with a cricket bat. And so Raj didn't like his father very much. But they had a chance in this afterlife scenario to talk about their own lives and to get the other person to understand why these things had happened. And his father had always been frustrated because he wanted to go to college and be an engineer. And because of the way the politics were in India at the time, he really couldn't do that. He ended up being an air traffic controller, but he was always frustrated with that. Sounds like a great job to me. But but he was always frustrated with that, and he didn't want his son to fall into the same trap. So he was very hard on Raj. And so Raj said that by meeting his father, he felt that he really understood him and he understood their relationship. And that was a big healing for him. Then he went into a tunnel, and he was surrounded by dead relatives. And I will say in passing that in the research, it's always dead relatives. You don't see someone who's not dead. You see people who have passed in your family. And so he saw all these people, that some that he didn't recognize and later recognized them from old family photos, things like that. He went up into this tunnel and he was greeted by a being of light. And he he could see that, yeah, a lot of people go into the light and they say, well, God was there, Jesus was there, Muhammad was there. Muhammad's never there, but then in fact, when you ask them, what does God look like? They can't describe it because they say, well, he was there and I had the sense that it was God, but I don't know who it was. So he saw a being of light, and this being of light took him on a life review and determined that he was far too materialistic. And he said it was really a very kind conversation, that the being of light just talked to him about all the cars and houses he owned, and that he really wasn't devoting enough time to his family and devoting to his patients. He wasn't really attending his patients very well. And this being of light suggested that he quit medicine and practice consciousness-based healing. And Raj says, that's a great idea. What's consciousness-based healing? And this godlike figure said, you have to figure that out. I'm not going to tell you. In the meantime, he gave him two angels. And to this day, Raj, when he meditates every day, if he needs to, can call on the angels and for counsel. And they won't tell him what consciousness-based healing is either, but he's on the right path. He's dealing in addiction medicine because he was addicted for a long time to painkillers when he was a doctor. So he left the practice, and they had an enormous home and enormous cars and Hummers and all this other stuff. And he got rid of all of it, got a Toyota, and they moved to Santa Cruz, California. And he's working on putting together an addiction medicine, without medicine, addiction holistic clinic. And that's his idea of what consciousness-based healing would be. So there's two examples of people with very extensive heavenly experiences. There's many others.
Yes, there's many others, and I'm sure after 30 plus years of researching all of these, there's some profound stories, and kind of proof of life after life is kind of a compilation of proofs that you and Dr. Moody have discovered over these 30 years. Can you tell me what you look for when you consider it proof? What makes it proof?
Well, we looked at all the possibilities, and we came up with many, many different ways of showing proof. And then we tried to combine them because we didn't want it to have a book that was, 150 reasons to believe in heaven. We just wanted to have like 7 or 8 or 9. And we combine those. What you look for is, frankly, you look at the research that's been done, because there is research that has been done on case studies, what people see when they die. Uh, and we've looked for people. There are case studies, surprisingly, that are like shared death experiences. Some of them go way back. Some of them go back to the 17th, 18th century, and they were found by researchers who will find old boxes of medical records that are kept in hospitals, and they would go through them and look for. They weren't, near-death experience is a new term, and it was in 1976, I believe, when Raymond named it that. And so they couldn't look for a near-death experience. They had to go read everything, what patients reported. And so we got those cases. We put together cases of our own. I mean, we both have an extraordinary amount of conversations with people who call. And so, we'll tape record those. and talk to them about their experiences. And then that's easy to get. Near-death experiences are really easy to get. I mean, when I first started writing The Light Beyond with Raymond, I was out with some friends and they said, "What are you doing these days?" And I told them. A couple of them at the table said, "Well, that's bullshit. No one believes in that kind of thing." And so we were in a Denny's. It was late at night, and I stood up in the Denny's, and I told people I was a writer, told them what I was working on, and asked, "Has anybody in here ever experienced a near-death experience, or do they have anyone in their family who has?" And out of 20 people, because it was late at night, there were like 6 or 7 who had, not who had had them. A couple of them in the room had near-death experiences. The rest had seen family members experience them. And what we realized that is a lot of people they don't have a context in which to put it. So until there was named the near-death experience and defined with all the definition parts of it, uh, a lot of people didn't know what to do with their experiences. They didn't even know how to address them. But now, once you name something and define it, it gives people uh, a box to put things in. So we take those, and it's easy. Like I said, it was easy to find near-death experiences. It's much more difficult to find objective experiences because you have to deal with say the person who's had a near-death experience, and then you have to hear from someone generally if anyone else witnessed that experience. And so it's hard to get them for that reason, because you don't want to put a thought in someone's head and have them make up a story. You want to hear that they had been telling a story, and that's what you go after. So, for example, we had some shared death experiences that were quite old. There was a woman, well, not quite old. I think it was in the 70s. Vi Horton, who was a patient of Raymond's in Georgia, and she had what happened to her? She had some kind of a gallbladder rupture or something, and she was taken to the hospital, and she was taken alone to the hospital in an ambulance, and the doctors immediately went to work on her. And so in the waiting room came her daughters, 2 daughters, and her husband and her brother-in-law a little bit later came in. And when the surgery was over, and Vi almost died, and they brought her back, and she started telling them that she had left her body, telling the doctors. She described everything in detail about what they were doing when they were doing the surgery. And then she said, and I left the room, I left the surgery area, and I went into the waiting room. And there she saw her daughters, she described as being dressed in mismatched plaid because they'd been in a rush to get to the hospital. Her husband was there, and she was able to recount later conversations he had. And then the most extraordinary one was her brother-in-law, who came in dressed for golf, went over to the payphone, and he called his golf buddy and said, "I'm not going to make it today. Vi's sick, and I think she's about to kick the bucket." And so she heard that. And later, when everyone came and gathered in the room and spoke about it, she recounted all their conversations. And then she said to her brother-in-law, next time, just go play golf. I don't really care. I've been to the other side and it was all right. And so that's how we then selected out-of-body experiences as being a good way to prove life after death. Because what that shows is a separation of consciousness from the body, which would mean that consciousness somehow can exist separate from the body and somehow move around and still think, even though it's not with the body. And so that's one of the 7 ways of with 7 proofs of life after life.
I have had many out of body experiences, and that for me to experience that was proof for myself as well. I was like, wait a minute, how can you exist without the body?
Hmm.
I had never heard of out of body experiences before I had one. And I didn't even know what had happened to me once I did have one. I had to go consult a spiritual church. This was in the early 90s. And so
Yeah.
I can definitely understand how that is a huge proof that the consciousness exists without the body. And
Well,
I
tell
don't
me
think
about one of yours. Did you ever have an objective experience where someone said, "Yeah, you're right. I was in that room, and that is what transpired."
No, I didn't. I never really left my vicinity except for one time, and I think I went to more of like an astral realm. It
Oh,
was like
yeah.
a stale slice of time, is the best way I can describe it. There was no life there.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but I had many out of body experiences, and they didn't start until after my husband died, and I feel like he had a hand in that. So
Hmm.
I felt that was very interesting, and I had a shared death experience with him as well. But
Really?
um, you discuss in the book one of the proofs is terminal lucidity,
Right.
um, and I find that very interesting.
Hmm.
How is terminal lucidity kind of like the opposite of a near-death experience?
Well, it's an interesting thing because that's only been recently defined as well. I think in 2014 or something. And what that is it's a flash of life, of lucidity that takes place shortly before someone's death. So I'll tell you one that I witnessed before it was named and defined. My older son had been in a motorcycle accident, so he broke his femur, and he was in the hospital in Scottsdale, Arizona. And so I would go in every day and spend all day with him. And across the hall, they brought a man in who was in the end stages of dementia. And he was in his bed. He didn't move hardly at all. His family would come in daily, and he had like 4 or 5 family members. They would come in, stand around his bed, and talk to him. And he just wasn't there. And then one day, they came in, and he was standing on the bed, and they freaked out, but he wouldn't sit down. He seemed to be very cogent. He started talking to them about his will and how he wanted to leave this one that and that one this. And uh, and they were saying, we're going to be able to bring you home. You don't have to talk about this. You're well. And and they left. They were told to leave for the day. In the morning, by morning, he had died. That's terminal lucidity. It's where someone who is terminal suddenly becomes lucid. And it usually lasts for maybe a few days, maybe a few hours, and then they're gone. But it's a sign that there's something, we can link it with all these spiritual experiences, these mystical experiences, because it's as though something has left the brain. They are essentially dead. There's even a couple cases where there's people without brain waves who have come back. Not that brainwave machines are always that right, but that's a sign that consciousness, with many people, okay, that consciousness has left the body and is now able to communicate. That someone has essentially died, and then their consciousness has come back, or it's even come out. There's a lot of people who say that the mind isn't in the body, that the mind is outside the body. And that's what that would be linked to as well. That's controversial, as you can imagine. But there's many people who've had terminal lucidity. And it's now, because it's named and defined, it's being recognized in medical records. And so I think what we're going to see in the future is that will become one of the big areas of research in near-death studies.
The mind being outside the body.
Well, that is now already. I mean, they can't figure out consciousness. They don't know how consciousness takes place.
Hmm.
I mean, why is a rock not conscious and why are we conscious? They don't know how it works. And so then when you get into something like terminal lucidity, where it appears that life has left a body, but then, hey, it comes back again. And, why has that happened? I mean, some of these people are very, very, very sick and very, on the end, at the end, yet they come back full of lucidity and full of vigor. So that is a form of study. And there's some great terminal lucidity stories. These show up in old medical records. But like I say, it hasn't been named and defined yet. So this is from an old medical record in the early 20th century in Germany. There was a woman named Katrina Emmer, and she had had meningitis as a child, and she had never spoken in her life. She couldn't really talk. She couldn't really answer questions. She would grunt. She would foul herself. And this went on for decades. And then I think it was 1936 or 38, something like that, she she kind of died, and then she came back. They told her that they told everyone would gather around because she's passed on, and she came back, and she was aware of her surroundings. She sang a song to herself. The song was "Where does the soul find its home, its peace?" And I think that was an old religious hymn. And she sang. She didn't stand up, but I don't think, but she sat up and sang. Much of the mental hospital came in to see her because they'd known her for years, and they were all there to make sure to see what was going on. And and then she died the next day. She died. And what this indicated to the doctors who would take care for her, that no matter how far gone a person might be mentally, they would call it retarded then, how retarded she was, she still had personhood and she still deserved respect of personhood. That was one of their main conclusions. And they were totally puzzled about how consciousness came back and how she actually started speaking. This case, one of the doctors was a member of the Nazi Party, and the Nazis wanted to get rid of every mental patient or anyone who had any mental deficits. They wanted to eradicate them. And he stood up at a party meeting and told this story about Catherine Emmer, and said that this proves that she has personhood and that people in this state have a right to survive. They have a right to live because they're still people. And he won. So he staved that off. But I mean, that's one of the things that have happened in the world of terminal lucidity. That was one of the early cases.
One of the ways to find proof of the afterlife is to have an experience, some sort of spiritual experience of your own. There's no more need to, read books or convince anyone. If you have an experience that means something to you, that really and truly resonated with you. And
Sure.
one of the ways that Dr. Moody has been able to provide this to people is in what he calls the psychomantium.
Right.
Can
Yeah.
you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Raymond's a real student of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. And he started studying ways that they would connect with their dead relatives, with their dead loved ones. And he he found that they would go through a period of deprivation. In other words, they would in those days, and these facilities are still there in ancient in Greece now. They're called psychomantiums. You'd go into a cave and you would kind of be desensitized. You couldn't see well because it was so dark. And they would eat, but they would eat meager meals. and they would just be there alone, kind of meditating for a long period of time. And then when priests who were running these psychomantiums uh, decided that they were ready to have a visionary experience, they would take them into this big room, high ceilings, and in the middle of the room would be a fire, and the fire would be heating water. And on top of the water, they had poured just a kind of a thick layer of oil, probably olive oil. And they would then have the person gaze into this clear depth. And out of the depth would come visions. It would be visions of their family members. They would talk to them. Sometimes they saw who they wanted to see, and sometimes they saw someone else. They may have come there to see their wife, and instead they see their father. It would be that kind of experience. So Raymond looked at that, and then he looked at how it had been used since then. And he found that a lot of cultures, from the Mayan cultures even to the English, the British, uh, were using it. Queen Elizabeth I had a professional scryer, they call it, because that was what looking into a clear depth was called. It still is today, scrying. And this scryer was a guy named John Dee, and he he worked with Queen Elizabeth to have visionary encounters and to see the future if she could, to make decisions, which is what they did in Mayan culture as well. And uh, she saw that, for instance, she saw the Spanish Armada being destroyed by bad weather, and that's what happened. And everyone in John Dee had to be protected because he was thought of as being a witch, but he just knew about this stuff in the same way that Raymond knew through studies. And uh, so then Raymond decided to try to do the same thing and to create it in his own house. So in his home in Alabama, it was built in 1850, huge mill house. And he had I believe at the time he was using up rooms up in his attic. And he set up a psychomantium. It's very easy to do. It's a dark room, so you keep it dark, keep a faint light going to your side, so it kind of lights behind you, but it kind of lights behind you, but not really clear, so you're not really visible. And then in front, he puts a mirror, and the mirror reflects onto the back wall and the faint light, and it creates a wonderful optical illusion of clear depth. He had an astronaut come one time to see it, Edgar Mitchell. And Edgar Mitchell said, well, that's what you see when you look out of a ship is just endless, endless, endless view. And so he started doing this with patients, first with college students that he taught, and then he brought in other patients as well. And he taught them how to go. He had a whole system where he'd relax them. He would make sure they didn't drink caffeine. They'd go out and take a walk. They would bring photographs of departed loved ones, and Raymond would talk. And Raymond is such a wonderfully soothing voice to talk to. And he would talk for a while, and then he would take them into this room, and they would stare at the mirror that created the clear depth. Things would come out of the mirror. Uh, I did it, and I saw my father. Uh, Other people have seen their relatives very vividly. Others have come to see their mother, and they end up seeing their cousin. A depart. They are always seeing departed loved ones, though, and sometimes they would come out of the mirror, and they would sit down with the person and talk to them. And later on, uh, we had a woman come from Argentina. This is why we made it as one of the proofs of the afterlife. This woman from Argentina came. She did kind of she did everything Raymond said to do. She, uh, looked at photographs, tried to relax on and on, but she wanted the experience too fast. So she insisted on going into the room and gazing in the mirror, and she did that for about 2 hours, and nothing happened. So she went back to the hotel where she was. Her sister had flown there with her, and they sat in this room. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, so it was light. Uh, and they talked about the experience and how she was going to go back the next day and try again. And all of a sudden, these giant orbs appeared. I mean, they weren't like little orbs, they were orbs about the size of beach balls. Three came into the room, and luckily, her sister photographed them. And so I'll send you photographs and you can run it with this if you want. And uh, she started talking to one of the orbs. And she'd come to Alabama to see her dead daughter. And so she didn't see her daughter in this orb, it came right in front of her. But she was able to communicate with her daughter through the orb. And luckily we got that photograph. And to both of us, that was proof positive that something palpable had happened. But even before that, other people would have these experiences, and they wouldn't have people come out of the mirror but they would. But later on, I'm getting a little confused here. Later on, these people in the mirror would visit them at the hotel. And there was one woman whose son had died of AIDS, and she awoke in the middle of the night, and her son was there in the room. And she spoke to him, and they had a conversation. And then she said, "How do I know you're really here?" And she said he hugged her and picked her up. But, the most important thing in all of this was that we have this photograph of these orbs, because that is objective proof.
That is just amazing to me that she had a visitation that was so physical that he was able
Oh
to pick
yeah.
her up. So I also visited Dr. Moody's psychomantium when he lived in Alabama, and it was a remarkable experience. We did all those things. I unfortunately didn't see anything in the mirror at that time, but I
Mhm.
went home and I made one in my home, and I did eventually have an experience with the psychomantium of my husband. So I can vouch that it does work, and it's very magical.
Was it helpful?
It was helpful. Yes, it was very helpful.
I mean, to you, were you convinced that he was in an afterlife situation?
Yes, it was one of the experiences. There was a whole plethora of experiences surrounding his death that changed everything about my beliefs of death and the afterlife, and that was one of them. Very
Wow.
much so. It's so profound, and I tell people about it to this day still because it was incredibly powerful.
Hmm.
It was also a physical experience. I could
Really?
feel he touched my arm and I could feel it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you touch him?
I didn't try. I was just in awe,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Right. I understand. I've heard all these cases like this, and it's what we all have always said since we started writing these books is people don't believe it until it happens to them.
Hmm.
And to an extent that's even true now, even though we presented so much research. I feel that we've proven a life after death, but I also think that it's like with near-death experiences, you have to keep collecting more and more and more case studies, because these are really a study of stories. And so you have to have that running narrative going. At some point, more and more of these physical ones, where there's a physical connection or where there's a photograph of an orb, more and more of those will come through. And that'll even strengthen our research even more. So that's what we're looking for in that regard for the future. And then you have to let the research take you where it wants to go.
What are your personal beliefs of the afterlife outside of research?
It's funny because I started out 37 years ago not really believing this, or thinking it was just phantasms of the brain, of a dying brain, as other people have said. And I don't feel that way anymore. I think there's something there that's different. So like there's a separation between mind and body. There's also a third thing, and that's mysticism or the paranormal that hasn't really been measured yet. So it would be nice to somehow be able to measure that. But right now, I can't think of how you do that other than to keep getting more and more uh, case studies. So that's in this field, that's where I'm going.
And if the listeners have stories or they have something that they'd like to share with you, how can they find you?
They can look on my website. It's at paulperryproductions.com, or they can send me an email at, I don't know if you write this down later, but pperry87 @cox.net. And I would love to have communication from them.
Paul, this has been amazing. It has been an honor to have you as my guest. I've been
Great
trying
to
to
be
get you
here.
on for a long time and I finally got it. So thank you so much. I
Okay,
really
thank you very
appreciate
much.
you.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye bye. Thank you for being here. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here and supporting my channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing if you enjoy near death experiences and other spiritually transformative stories. It helps the algorithm know that this information is useful and push it out to more people. And that's the goal, to get as many people to know that we are eternal spiritual beings and that we never die. Our bodies might die, but our essence will never die. And I want people to live with less fear. Let's all spread the word. Like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that little notification bell so you get all the notifications when my videos post. Thank you for all of your support. I'm sending love to you.